Most enterprises talk about connectivity like it's plumbing. Connect system A to system B, add a connector, call it transformation. That assumption feels safe. It's also why the same organizations keep replatforming every 3 years. Here's the promise. This is not a demo tour. It's a set of executive mental models you can reuse. Why Logic Apps is the execution spine, why Copilot Studio is the intent interface, and why MCP matters even when connectors already exist. Keep one question in mind. What problem are we actually solving? The foundational misunderstanding. Integration isn't the problem. This is the uncomfortable truth. Enterprises don't fail because systems can't connect. They fail because intent can't survive handoffs. The average organization already has connectivity. It has APIs, it has connectors, it has ETL, it has integration platforms. And yet the business still experiences the same outcomes: delays, rework, audit panic, and a constant feeling that automation should be easier than this. That's not a tooling gap, that's an intent gap. Every time a process crosses a boundary, team boundary, system boundary, vendor boundary, you lose context. And when you lose context, people improvise. They open tickets, they add exceptions, they make a spreadsheet, they ask for temporary access. They build a side flow just for this one case. Those are not edge cases, those are entropy generators. Most organizations describe this as automation backlog. Architecturally, it's something else. You are using humans as message buses, and you are using tickets as state machines. A hiring manager fills in a form, HR copies it into another system, IT gets a ticket, someone in identity makes an account, someone else assigns groups. Payroll needs a different attribute. Facilities needs a badge request. A manager sends a Teams message. Can we expedite? And the actual state of the onboarding exists nowhere. It exists in fragments, half in the HR system, half in the ticketing system, half in email threads. And the final truth is whoever you can find on Slack at 9 p.m. That's what integration looks like in practice. And here's the trap. When leadership says we need better integration, they usually mean we need the humans to stop doing this. But the humans are doing it because the system does not preserve intent across steps. It preserves transactions, not decisions. Automation in most enterprises is treated as a set of isolated scripts. When X happens, do Y. The coordination is what the enterprise actually needs. When X happens, what are we trying to achieve? Under which constraints? And with what proof? This is why AI changes the story, and also why AI makes everything worse if you treat it like a UI feature. If you bolt a chatbot onto a broken handoff, you haven't eliminated the handoff. You've made it non-deterministic. Now, the system doesn't just lose intent between teams. It can lose intent mid-sentence. You ask for provision access for the new hire, and the model guesses what access means. It guesses which system is the source of truth. It guesses which group naming convention matters. It guesses whether finance analyst implies SAP roles or just a distribution list. And when it guesses wrong, the enterprise pays for it in the only currency that matters: incident reviews and audit findings. So the foundational misunderstanding is this. AI isn't a smarter form. It's not a friendlier UI for the same integration spaghetti. Architecturally, you are building a distributed decision engine. That distinction matters. A decision engine needs two things if you want it to scale without turning into conditional chaos: constraints and traceability. Constraints: what actions are allowed, what data can move, what pathways are legitimate. Traceability: what happened, who triggered it, what was decided, what tools were called, what was written, and where the evidence lives. Now connect that back to the real world. Executives don't wake up worried about connectors. They wake up worried about, why did we grant that access? And why did finance get the wrong number? Why did the integration break during quarter close? Why did this take 3 weeks when it should take 3 hours? Those are intent failures. And they compound over time because every workaround becomes precedent. Every exception becomes a pattern. Every temporary bypass becomes a dependency. Eventually, policy exists in PowerPoint, but execution exists in whatever the last person did under pressure. The solution isn't more integration. The solution is an architecture where intent can be expressed, interpreted, and executed without being reinvented at every hop. That's the spine for the rest of this episode. Copilot Studio is where intent shows up in human language. Logic Apps is where execution becomes deterministic, auditable, and boring on purpose. And MCP is the contract that stops the model from improvising when it reaches for the enterprise. Now we can define MCP in terms that executives can actually reuse. MCP in plain terms: a contract between reasoning and doing. Okay, so basically, MCP, Model Context Protocol, is a way to stop your AI from freelancing inside your enterprise. Kent Ware defines it cleanly. It is an open protocol that enables seamless integration between large language model applications or agents and tools and data. That sounds abstract until you translate it into what it prevents. MCP is not an API replacement. It's not yet another connector. It's not a new integration platform you buy because you're tired of the old integration platform you bought. MCP is a tool contract, a contract between reasoning and doing. The reasoning side is the model, non-deterministic, context-driven, good at language, good at picking an approach. The doing side is the enterprise, deterministic systems of record, compliance boundaries, rate limits, business rules, and the minor detail that finance will notice if you write the wrong thing. Without a contract, models guess. They guess which endpoint matters. They guess which parameters are required. They guess what create record means. They guess which account you meant, and you can't govern guessing. You can only apologize for it later. With MCP, you give the model a catalog of tools with explicit names, schemas, and descriptions. The model doesn't need to invent a pathway. It chooses from approved pathways. That's the real shift, from the model can call anything to the model can only call what you published. Now here's what most people miss. Enterprises already have connectors. Logic Apps has 400 plus connectors. Power Platform has connectors. Copilot Studio has connectors. So why care about MCP at all? Because connectors are not governance. Connectors are plumbing. At scale, connectors become connector sprawl. Thousands of small, slightly different integrations built by different teams with different naming, different fields, different error handling, and different security assumptions. It works until it doesn't, and then you discover your business process is implemented as folklore. MCP is an attempt to standardize the shape of tool usage for models the same way APIs standardize the shape of system-to-system calls. But it's more specific than APIs. APIs are designed for developers who already know what they're doing and want maximum flexibility. MCP tools are designed for models that need constraints to be safe and cheap. That's why MCP tools are typically task-focused, not here's a generic CRUD interface to your entire CRM. More like, create a contact in Salesforce with these 5 fields, or list incidents in ServiceNow with these filters, or update an opportunity stage with these allowed values. You are narrowing the surface area on purpose. Because the model's job isn't to explore your entire schema. The model's job is to execute the business intent you allow. This is also why MCP shows up now, not 5 years ago. The world moved to multi-agent reality and multi-platform reality. You will have Copilot Studio in parts of the org. You will have Foundry in parts of the org. You will have GitHub Copilot in engineering. You will have third-party agents showing up anyway, and every one of those will want to use tools. MCP is vendor-agnostic pressure relief, a standard shape for tools so you can build once, publish once, and reuse across agent surfaces. And here's the consequence executives should care about. MCP reduces the amount of bespoke glue you have to govern. Not because it removes complexity, because it concentrates complexity into deliberate, reviewable, auditable tool definitions. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember this. MCP doesn't make the model smarter. It makes the model less creative in the places where creativity is a liability. Logic Apps. What it is architecturally, not what marketing says. Logic Apps is usually introduced as low-code workflow automation. That description is not wrong, it's just incomplete in the way that gets organizations hurt. Architecturally, Logic Apps is not an automation toy. It is an execution runtime with a connector fabric and an observability plane glued to it. That combination matters because the moment you introduce AI reasoning, the only sane move is to make execution boring, deterministic, and reviewable. Kent Ware points out the awkward reality. Logic Apps has been around almost 10 years. It launched in 2016. That's not trivia. It means enterprises have already been running business-critical integrations on it long before anyone started saying agentic. The muscle is there. Triggers, connectors, retries, compensation patterns, run history, and the miserable lessons that show up after the first time an integration fails during quarter close. So what is it in system terms? Logic Apps is a workflow runtime that can accept a trigger, perform a sequence of calls, and then persist an auditable record of what happened. It's the thing that turns we should update 3 systems when this event happens into an artifact you can trace, rerun, and prove. And the connector part is the other half of the story. Logic Apps has a large connector library. Kent calls out 1,400 plus. That means an organization doesn't start from a blank sheet every time it needs to touch ServiceNow, SAP, Salesforce, Teams, Dataverse, SQL, or some random SaaS someone bought with a credit card. But here's the shift. In an MCP world, connectors are not the endpoint, they're raw material. Logic Apps becomes the place where you wrap raw connector actions into governed tools and workflows. You decide what is exposed, you decide what is hidden, you decide what inputs matter, you decide what outputs return. And you do it once in a way that can be reused. Now, deployment models. Most people gloss over this. Logic Apps has 3 deployment models. Consumption, standard, and hybrid. That is not a feature list. It is a control plane decision. Consumption is multi-tenant. It's convenient. It's also by design not where you go when you need tight network boundaries and predictable execution at scale. Standard is single tenant. Kent describes it as single tenancy, dedicated compute, dedicated storage, networking. That's the key. In standard, the workflow runs inside compute you control. With networking, you can shape. And with identity primitives that don't require you to play the where did this secret get copied game. Hybrid is the extension of that idea when you need to bring the runtime closer to your environment. Arc-connected Kubernetes, semi-connected execution, data staying local with telemetry syncing back. That's for the parts of the enterprise that still live in reality: factories, regulated networks, awkward latency, and the unspoken requirement that cloud outage cannot equal business outage. So why does any of this matter for Copilot and MCP? Because the execution plane needs properties the reasoning plane will never have: deterministic behavior, predictable retries, clear failure modes, and a run history that can serve as evidence. Logic Apps gives you that by default. It's not glamorous, it's not conversational, it does not pretend to be intelligent. Good. In the AI era, the most valuable system is the one that refuses to improvise. And that's why Logic Apps becomes the practical MCP factory inside Microsoft estates. It can take your enterprise's messy reality, connectors, networks, identities, throttling, retries, and package it into tools that are safe enough for a model to use without turning every request into a new experiment. Now we can place Copilot Studio correctly, not as the thing that integrates everything, as the thing that decides what should happen, then hands execution to something that can be held accountable. Copilot Studio, the intent interface, not the integration layer. Copilot Studio is where most leaders want to start because it looks like the business. A person asks a question. The system answers. It feels like progress. But the moment you confuse that interface for the integration layer, you've quietly rebuilt the same old problem. You've put business intent inside a surface that can't own the enterprise's execution debt. That distinction matters. Copilot Studio is excellent at three things: conversation, decision framing, and tool selection. Conversation means it can pull context out of humans without forcing them through a form they hate. Hiring managers don't want to know which attribute maps to which HR field. They want to say start date is the 15th, remote needs contractor access, and yes, finance systems. Copilot Studio can extract that cleanly. Decision framing means it can take fuzzy requests and turn them into a structured intent. What is the user trying to achieve? What constraints are implied? What information is missing? What needs approval? That is not integration. That's interpretation. Tool selection means it can choose the next action from a defined set of tools based on descriptions and schemas. And that's where it becomes dangerous if your tools are a mess, because the model will still choose, even if the choices are ambiguous. Here's the foundational mistake organizations make. They assume Copilot Studio should just connect to systems of record directly because it can. It shouldn't. When Copilot Studio calls a connector directly, you've embedded execution inside the reasoning plane. You've made the model responsible for error handling, retries, compensations, and the kinds of boring transactional guarantees that humans expect and systems rarely provide. That is not an AI problem. That is an architecture problem. Now, to be fair, the tools landscape inside Copilot Studio is getting broader and more capable. You can use prompts, you can use connectors, you can use agent flows, you can use computer use for UI automation when the API story is terrible, and now you can use MCP. But each of those tools exists on a spectrum of governance. Prompts are flexible, but they're not evidence. Connectors are convenient, but they're not a control plane. Agent flows can be structured, but they still need an execution spine behind them if you want consistent enterprise behavior. Computer use is powerful, but it is literally automation through screens. That is the opposite of stable, and MCP is the one that forces you to stop pretending the model can safely improvise. This is why Kent's question lands. Copilot Studio has connectivity, so why do I care about MCP server? Because the enterprise doesn't care that a single agent can do a thing once. The enterprise cares that the next 10 agents don't each invent their own way to do the same thing. MCP servers are how you make connectivity reusable, reviewable, and portable across agent platforms. You build the tool contract once, publish it, and then Copilot Studio, Foundry, VS Code, and whatever else shows up next can consume the same governed capabilities. It's also how you prevent connector sprawl from becoming agent sprawl. If every team can attach connectors directly to their agent, your security model will drift. Your data movement will drift. Your approval logic will drift. Not because people are reckless. Because entropy always wins when enforcement is optional. So Copilot Studio's role is specific. It is the intent interface. It is where humans express what they want. It is where the system asks the right follow-up questions. It is where reasoning happens. And then it hands off to an execution layer that doesn't negotiate. That handoff is not a minor implementation detail. It's the architecture. Copilot Studio, without an execution spine, becomes a high-end demo machine. Impressive in a meeting, unpredictable in production. Copilot Studio, with a governed execution layer, becomes a scalable operating model. Consistent decisions, constrained actions, and traceability you can defend in an audit. Now we can introduce the executive mental model that makes this click. 2 planes, 2 jobs, and a hard boundary between decide and do. The 2-plane model, reasoning plane versus execution plane. Here's what most organizations miss until the first incident review. AI doesn't automate workflows. AI changes where decisions get made, and once decisions move, control either follows by design or it evaporates by accident. So the executive mental model is this: two planes, a reasoning plane and an execution plane. The reasoning plane is Copilot Studio. It's conversational, it's adaptive, it's probabilistic by nature, it's good at interpreting messy human intent, asking for missing context, and deciding which option fits the moment. But it is not deterministic. It will never be deterministic. That's not a bug. That's what makes it useful. The execution plane is logic apps. It's transactional. It's auditable. It's designed to be boring. It takes a decision and turns it into a series of controlled actions against systems of record, with retries, compensations, and a run history that can survive an audit. It is deterministic on purpose. That distinction matters. Because if you blend the planes, you get conditional chaos. A system where outcomes vary based on phrasing, context drift, tool ambiguity, or a model update you didn't schedule. In the two-plane model, each plane has a job it can actually do well. In the reasoning plane, the job is interpret intent. What is the user really asking for? What policy constraints apply? What approvals are needed? What information is missing? And critically, what tool should be called next? In the execution plane, the job is enforce intent. Make the call the same way every time. Validate inputs. Handle failures predictably. Write to the right system in the right order with the right identity. Capture the evidence. Now connect this to the line that should be written on a whiteboard in every AI transformation steering committee. Copilot decides what should happen. Logic Apps ensures it happens within your compliance boundaries. If Copilot makes a decision that violates policy, the execution plane should refuse. If Copilot makes a decision without required data, the execution plane should force the missing fields. If Copilot makes a decision that triggers a risky operation, the execution plane should require an approval pathway or an escalation. This is where MCP becomes more than a protocol and starts acting like the seam between planes. MCP is how the reasoning plane asks the execution plane to do something without improvising the mechanics. The tool name is fixed, the schema is fixed, the inputs are explicit, the outputs are structured, the model stops guessing, it starts selecting. And that changes everything about blast radius, because the most dangerous idea in enterprise AI is AI inside every workflow. That sounds modern. It's also how you end up with non-deterministic writes to your systems of record, scattered across dozens of agents, each with slightly different prompts, slightly different tools, and slightly different security assumptions. In other words, policy drift at machine speed. The two-plane model reduces that risk by design. You don't let reasoning leak into execution. You don't let execution logic get rebuilt in every agent. You centralize execution into an orchestration layer that is observable, governable, and repeatable. Then you let AI do what it's actually good at, understanding humans and choosing among constrained options. This also scales organizationally. Agent builders can focus on intents, conversations, and decision quality. Workflow owners can focus on integration integrity, idempotency, and data contracts. Operators can focus on run history, failures, and evidence. That role separation is not bureaucracy. It's how you stop privilege sprawl and tool sprawl from becoming permanent. And if you're listening for the payoff, this is why MCP matters even when connectors exist. Connectors let you call systems. MCP, paired with an execution plane, lets you call systems safely. That's the difference between it works in a demo and it survives quarter close. Now that the model is clear, we can narrate what this actually looks like end to end. Event, reasoning, orchestration, and an audit trail that doesn't rely on someone's memory. Walkthrough, narrated. Event, reasoning, orchestration, audit trail. Here's the narrated version of what actually happens when this architecture is working end-to-end without screens. Start with a real signal, not a user clicked a button demo signal. A real enterprise event. A new hire is approved in the HR system. An invoice lands in a shared mailbox. A Servitude ticket gets created in your ITSM platform. A pricing update is published from SAP. Something changes and now the enterprise has to respond. That event is the trigger. And the first discipline is this: don't let the trigger become the workflow. A trigger is just a fact. It says something happened. The reasoning plane is where the system decides what that fact means in business terms. So Copilot Studio takes the event, plus whatever context is allowed to see, and it does the part humans usually do in chat messages and half-filled tickets: interpretation. For HR onboarding, it looks at the hire request and immediately starts asking the questions that always get asked too late. Role, location, start date, manager, equipment needs, standard access versus special access, contractor versus employee, and whether any approvals are missing. For invoice exceptions, it does the thing accounts payable teams hate doing manually. Why was this rejected? It reads the rejection reason, asks for missing context, normalizes vendor names, and figures out whether this is a mismatch, a missing PO, a limit breach, or an approval gap. For IT service automation, it identifies the intent: password reset, device compliance, VPN access, mailbox permissions, whatever your tier catalog actually contains. And it checks whether this is within policy or needs escalation. Now here's the key. Copilot Studio is not calling random connectors because it can. It is selecting tools, MCP tools, tools with names and schemas that were designed in advance. This is where the system stops being a chatbot and starts behaving like a constrained operator. The agent sees a tool catalog and chooses a tool based on description and required inputs. It's not inventing an endpoint. It's not guessing at field names. It's selecting from what you published. And yes, the descriptions matter because they become decision inputs for the model. When Ken said MCP enables seamless integration between large language model applications or agents and tools and data, that's what seamless really means. The model gets a clean menu instead of a junk drawer. So Copilot Studio chooses the tool, fills in the schema, and hands off the request to the execution plane. Now Logic Apps takes over. This is where the enterprise stops debating what should happen and starts doing what is allowed to happen. Logic Apps executes connector calls, but it does it with boring features that matter in production: retries, timeouts, compensating actions, and controlled sequencing. If a downstream system throttles, it retries in the right way. If a step fails after partial success, it compensates or it routes to a human approval path. If a call needs enrichment, look up the manager's ID, map the vendor number, translate a location code. Logic Apps does it deterministically. And this is why Logic Apps is the execution spine. It doesn't just call APIs. It owns the workflow reality the enterprise depends on. Now, the part executives should care about even more than the automation is the evidence trail, because enterprises don't get punished for automating. They get punished for not being able to prove what happened. Logic Apps gives you run history. And when you run MCP tools through it, you get a full chain: the trigger event, the parameters passed, the connector calls made, the responses received, and the final output. Kent described it as full traceability, inputs, outputs, what the user said, what the agent responded. We've got a very complete picture. That is not a nice to have. That is the difference between an automation you can scale and an automation you quietly turn off after the first compliance review. The output is simple: systems update, tickets close, records reconcile, access provisions, approvals route, and humans only touch the weird cases. But the real product isn't the update. The real product is that the enterprise can replay the truth. When someone asks, "Who approved this?" you don't search teams, you pull the run. When someone asks, "Why did the agent do that?" you don't blame the model, you show the tool call and the policy boundary it hit. And once you have that, you're not building automations anymore. You're building a governed decision and execution pipeline. Now we can talk about the part that determines whether this scales or collapses: tool design. Tool design is governance, avoiding conditional chaos. This is where most agentic enterprise conversations collapse into a polite disaster: tool design. Not model selection, not prompt tuning, not which chat surface you picked. Tool design. Because once a model has tools, it will use them. And if the tools are vague, overlapping, or overpowered, you've created conditional chaos with a friendly UI. Ken said the line that should permanently ruin the idea of just expose the connector. Create record of what? That question isn't pedantic. It's the entire governance problem in one sentence. In an enterprise connector, create record usually means create anything in a system that contains hundreds of entities and thousands of fields. Humans can handle that because humans carry context and caution. Models don't. Models optimize for completing the task, and they will happily fill in blanks with guesses that look plausible. So the first rule of MCP tool design is simple: generic tools don't scale. They scale ambiguity. And ambiguity is expensive, in tokens, in retries, in wrong writes, and in the time you'll spend explaining to audit why an AI wrote something to somewhere because the tool allowed it. The counterintuitive part is that governance isn't a policy document. Governance is what you expose. If you expose a tool that can write to 10 tables, you've already lost the argument that you control the system. Control is not what you intended. Control is what the interface permits. So you design tools, like you design guardrails, narrow surface area, clear intent, constrained inputs, predictable outputs. And the output constraints matter more than most people think because tool responses become model context. If you return the entire record payload every time, you're not being thorough. You're burning tokens and feeding the model noise it will treat as relevant. The simple version is your tool schema is your policy boundary. Now, practical consequences. If you build an MCP tool called Update Opportunity and it accepts any field in the opportunity object, the model will eventually update the wrong field. Not because it's malicious, because it is trying to be helpful in a schema it can't fully reason about. But if you build advanced opportunity stage with allowed values, required IDs, and a constrained output that returns the new stage, timestamp, and a correlation ID, you've done something different. You've turned a risky write into a controlled action. That distinction matters. And this is where Logic Apps becomes more than an execution engine. It becomes a tool compiler. You take raw connectors and you wrap them into tools that match business verbs, not platform verbs. Provision day one access. Create incident with severity, validate invoice against PO, sync pricing changes with item potency. Those aren't connector operations. They're governed capabilities. Now, the part everyone underestimates, tool descriptions. Tool descriptions are not documentation, they're decision inputs. A model doesn't read your wiki, it reads the tool catalog description and schema. That's what it uses to decide whether a tool fits the situation. If the description is generic, the model's selection is probabilistic. If the description is precise, the model's selection becomes constrained. So you write descriptions like you're writing for a deterministic system, because you are. This tool creates a Salesforce contact with last name, email, and account ID. Use it only when a human confirms the contact should be created. That is governance. And the moment you do that consistently, something else happens. You reduce tool collisions. You reduce duplicate tools across teams. You reduce the temptation for every agent builder to invent their own slightly different version of the same capability, because they don't need to. This is also where you kill entropy generators early. Policy exceptions thrive in ambiguity. Side channels thrive when the official path is harder than the unofficial one. Shadow integrations appear when the blessed tool can't answer the real question. Well-designed tools remove those escape hatches, not by telling people to behave, by making the correct path the easiest path. Now tie this back to governance as an enabler. A tool catalog that's curated and constrained is what allows you to move faster without losing control. It's how you let teams build agents quickly without granting them raw access to systems of record. It's how you let Copilot Studio do things without turning every action into a bespoke security review. You don't govern agent behavior by reviewing every conversation. You govern it by designing what actions are possible. That's why MCP matters. It's not just a protocol. It's a forcing function that makes tool design the unit of governance. And once tool design is governance, you stop arguing about whether AI is safe. You start proving it. Scenario 1. HR onboarding across systems. HR onboarding is the universal enterprise mess because it looks simple until you try to do it consistently. A person is hired. They need an identity. They need a mailbox. They need access. They need a device. They need payroll. They need just one exception because the new hire is remote or a contractor or joining finance or starting tomorrow or all of the above. And every one of those needs lives in a different system owned by a different team with a different definition of done. So here's the strategic framing. Onboarding isn't an integration problem. It's a coordination problem with security consequences. Because the moment onboarding becomes a ticket relay race, two things always happen. First, you lose time. Day 1 readiness turns into day 3 readiness, then day 7 readiness, then they'll be fine with shared access for now. Second, you lose control. Emergency access becomes normal access. Manual overrides become permanent pathways. And nobody can prove why a given person got a given entitlement because the decision lived in an email and the execution happened in 4 different places. Now, drop Copilot Studio and Logic apps into that reality. The intent interface is Copilot Studio. The hiring manager doesn't need to know what entra attribute maps to what downstream system. They need to communicate intent in human terms. Role, location, start date, manager, department, employment type, and whether standard access applies or special access is required. And Copilot Studio's job is not to guess the answer. It's to interrogate the request until the request becomes executable. This is where you reduce entropy early. The agent asks the questions humans usually ask too late. It confirms whether the person is employee or contractor, whether they need privileged access, whether they handle regulated data, whether they require SIP roles, whether they need a device shipped, and whether approvals exist for any non-standard entitlements. Then the handoff happens. Copilot selects a tool, not a connector, a tool with a name that encodes your governance intent, like start onboarding for new hire, or provision day 1 access. And this is where MCP matters. The model isn't improvising a sequence of connector calls. It is calling a published capability with a schema you defined. The request goes into Logic Apps. And Logic Apps does the boring work that you actually want boring. It creates the identity using managed identity, not shared credentials. It assigns baseline groups using explicit mappings, not whatever the model thinks. It provisions the mailbox, triggers device enrollment tasks, creates payroll records, and opens or updates the ITSM ticket so the operational teams see a single authoritative state. If something fails, it doesn't apologize. It retries, it compensates, it escalates. This is the part executives miss. You aren't automating onboarding. You're automating the control plane for onboarding because the workflow becomes the place where you enforce what done means. And you can enforce separation of duties by design. Agent builders can define the conversational experience and the intent model. Workflow owners control the execution layer. Which systems are touched, in what order, with what identity, and what evidence is recorded. Operators monitor runs and failures without needing access to redesigned tools. That RBAC split matters because onboarding is where privilege sprawl starts. Now take the scenario everyone has. Special access. A manager says they'll need finance reporting access on day 1. In the old model, that becomes a side channel, a Teams message to someone who can do it real quick. In this model, Copilot collects the justification and routes it into the workflow. Logic Apps enforces the policy boundary. Either it requires an approval step, or it queues it for a privileged workflow, or it refuses unless the request meets conditions you defined. Same request, different outcome. Not because the AI is smarter, because the system is constrained and the audit story becomes clean. If someone asks, why did this person receive that access? You don't reconstruct the narrative from 5 systems. You open the run history. You see who asked, what was asked, what approvals were captured, what tools were called, what groups were assigned, and what downstream updates were made. That is the actual value of enterprise connectivity in an AI era. Not faster clicks, but fewer untracked decisions. And the business outcome is easy to say without hype. Fewer manual handoffs, faster day one readiness, fewer access mistakes, and a measurable reduction in the hidden labor of coordination. Now that the pattern is clear, the next scenario makes the same point from a different angle. Invoices aren't hard. Exceptions are. Scenario 2, invoice processing and exception handling. Invoice automation is always sold as a paper-to-ERP story. Scan the PDF, extract the fields, match the PO, post the invoice, done. That's the brochure version. In reality, invoices aren't hard. Exceptions are endless and they're usually undocumented. The vendor name doesn't match what procurement entered 3 years ago. The PO is missing, but we always pay this vendor. The amounts don't line up because someone changed pricing after the PO. The approval threshold got exceeded by $12. The cost center is wrong. The invoice got emailed to the wrong mailbox. The line items are structured like a ransom note. And every business unit has its own definition of urgent. So the enterprise cost isn't invoice processing, it's human exception triage. And that triage is almost always done in the worst possible place. Email threads and comments inside whatever ERP screen someone happens to know. Here's the architectural reframing. Invoice exceptions are a coordination problem with money attached. That means 2 things. First, you need a reasoning surface that can collect context without forcing AP to become a detective. Second, you need an execution layer that refuses to just post it when policy says otherwise. And this is where Copilot Studio earns its place, not by automating finance, by handling the conversation nobody wants to have manually 50 times a day. When an invoice fails validation, the agent can answer the only question people actually ask: why was this rejected? And it can do the follow-up work that humans usually do via back and forth. Which PO should this map to? Is this a duplicate? Who owns this cost center? Do you want to split the amount? Is this a legitimate exception? And if so, who can approve it? That matters because it pulls intent out of the business in plain language. But then the system has to stop being polite and start being strict. This is where Logic Apps becomes the execution spine again. The model can reason across messy inputs, but the workflow decides what can move where. Logic Apps enforces validations, vendor match, PO match, limits, and approval routing. It does the ordering that keeps finance sane. Enrich invoice data, check against authoritative systems, route to approvals if thresholds trip, then write back to the ERP only when the conditions are satisfied. And it does it with audit-grade behavior, deterministic steps, retries where retries make sense, and a recorded run history. Now at the part most AI demos skip because it's not as fun: DLP. In finance, DLP isn't a slide. It's the difference between we can deploy this and security shut it down. The practical model is simple. AI can reason across information. Workflows decide what information is allowed to move between systems. So you can let Copilot Studio interpret an exception, summarize what's missing, and ask the user for clarification, without granting it direct, unconstrained access to write into your system of record. Because authenticated does not mean authorized. And even authorized does not mean safe to execute without guardrails. Now, in MCP terms, this becomes a tool story. You don't expose a generic create invoice tool with 100 fields and vague meanings. You expose an invoice exception resolution toolset. Validate invoice against PO, retrieve vendor master details, request approval for exception type X, post invoice with correlation ID, and return a structured result that contains what happened and what evidence was created. The model doesn't freehand an ERP transaction, it selects from approved actions. And the best part is the outcome that executives actually care about. Humans only touch exceptions, not the happy path. Happy path invoices post automatically with boring reliability. Exceptions become structured conversations with constrained outcomes, and you can measure it in the only ways finance trusts: reduced cycle time, fewer manual touches per invoice, and fewer we don't know why this was posted moments that show up during close. This also changes the failure mode. In the old world, the failure mode is silent drift. Someone finds a workaround and it becomes policy by accident. In this world, the failure mode is explicit. The workflow refuses, routes, or escalates. And you can see it happen which means your control environment becomes a system, not a story. And once invoice exceptions stop consuming human attention, you get a second-order benefit. Your AP team stops spending time being a message bus and starts spending time on the only work worth human judgment, actual anomalies and actual fraud signals. Now, if you want the scenario where this becomes even more obvious, it's IT service automation. Because IT isn't paid to be creative, it is paid to be consistent under pressure with receipts. Scenario 3. IT service automation. IT service management is where enterprise reality shows up without makeup. Tickets are repetitive. Documentation is outdated the day after it's written. Tribal knowledge lives in the heads of two people you can't afford to lose. And the SLA clock keeps running even when the root cause is a user who swears they didn't change anything. So yes, it is a great place to start with agentic orchestration, not because it's glamorous, because it's measurable, painful, and full of work that should not require a human to interpret the same request for the 1,000th time. But here's the thing, most organizations get wrong when they try. They aim for AI resolves tickets. That's not the real objective. The real objective is AI handles standard intents, and the system escalates only when policy thresholds are crossed. Tier to Tier 2 is not a human hierarchy, it's a control boundary. Tier is self-service and safe automation. Password resets, account unlocks, basic access requests, known device compliance checks, standard VPN troubleshooting prompts, maybe a simple "how do I request" that routes to a knowledge base. Tier 1 is guided execution with guardrails. Do this action, then verify this condition, then notify the user. It's still mostly deterministic. It's the human doing the steps because the system didn't. Tier 2 is where the organization actually pays for judgment. Complex incidents, ambiguous symptoms, high-impact outages, or anything that can create collateral damage. Agentic orchestration is about moving work down the stack without moving risk up the stack. So here's the pattern. Copilot Studio becomes the intake and triage surface. It takes messy user language and turns it into a clean intent. Reset password, re-enroll device, request application access, check mailbox permissions, troubleshoot Teams audio, whatever your top ticket categories actually are. Then it does the part a ticket form never does well. It collects the missing context conversationally. Device name, error message, location, whether it's a new device or a rebuild, whether the user is traveling, whether this is affecting one person or a whole team. This seems small, it's not. Because IT tickets fail for the same reason invoices fail. Missing context forces humans to improvise. Then Copilot selects the tool. And this is where you need to be ruthless. IT tools are not query everything and do anything. That's how you end up with an agent that can disable accounts because someone phrased a question badly. Your MCP tools here should map to safe verbs. Reset password for user. Unlock account. Create incident with severity. Check device compliance. Request software access with a proval. Update ticket status. Notify user. If you're hearing repetition, good, repetition is the point. A safe enterprise is mostly repeated patterns executed consistently. Now Logic Apps takes the request and executes it. And this is where IT benefits from boring on purpose more than any other domain. Because IT automation isn't just do the thing. It's do the thing, then prove it worked, then record what happened. Logic Apps can update your ITSM platform, ServiceNow, Azure DevOps, whatever your reality is. It can call Graph for identity operations. It can integrate with endpoint tooling. It can post to Teams. It can send email. It can trigger follow-up actions. And it can do it with controlled retries and clear failure paths. If the password reset fails due to a lockout policy, the workflow doesn't keep guessing. It routes to escalation. If the device action fails, it captures the error, attaches it to the ticket, and moves the case to Tier 2 with evidence. This is the real win. You stop escalating tickets without context. You escalate with a record. Now add governance, because IT is where governance either becomes real or it becomes a slide. You separate roles. Agent designers build the conversational experience and intent routing. Workflow owners build and maintain the executable pathways. Operators watch run history and manage failures. And authentication does not equal authorization. The system can authenticate the agent and still restrict which tool calls are permitted for which scenarios, which users, and which groups. If you let any authenticated agent call any IT tool, you just created a new tier incident generator. This is also where managed identities and least privilege stop being best practice and start being survival. No shared credentials in a workflow, no copy-paste API keys inside an agent, no temporary service accounts that become permanent because nobody wants to rotate them. Now for the part executives will actually ask for, outcomes. In IT and HR, 20 to 40% ticket deflection is a credible range when you focus on the top repetitive intents. Not because the AI is brilliant, because the system finally stops requiring humans to coordinate between tools. And the bigger outcome is SLA protection. When the agent handles the standard work, humans get time back for real incidents. When escalations happen, they happen with context and evidence. When audits ask who changed what, you can answer without archaeology. Kent Ware even said it directly in the context of IT. IT service management, always a good place to start. He's not being optimistic, he's describing where the economics work first. And once you can prove this works in IT, where metrics are unforgiving, you have a template you can take to every other domain. The same two-plane model, the same constrained tools, the same deterministic execution, the same traceability. Now, the next scenario is where you find out whether your orchestration layer is real or just polite. Transactional sync across systems of record where failure isn't annoying. It's expensive. Scenario 4, SAP. Dataverse, low-B sync without breaking finance. SAP and finance adjacent systems are where just automated goes to die. Because the failure mode isn't a funny demo glitch, it's a reconciliation exercise that becomes someone's full-time job. Here's the pattern every enterprise recognizes. Pricing, customer master data, vendor master data, product catalog, cost centers, GL mappings, pick your poison. The business wants a change to show up everywhere, immediately and consistently. But the estate is a patchwork. SAP, Dataverse, a few line of business apps that matter way more than they look like they should, and an integration layer that's accumulated 5 years of temporary fixes. So teams try to sync, they build point-to-point calls, they wire up a connector, they do a nightly job, it works for a while. Then something fails silently. A request times out, a downstream API throttles, a duplicate update slips through, a schema changes, a retry replays the wrong step. The sync succeeds in one system and fails in another, and now your systems of record disagree. That is not a technical annoyance, that is financial risk. And this is where the two-plane model becomes non-negotiable. Copilot Studio can help interpret intent here. And yes, there is real value in that. A finance user doesn't want to file an integration request. They want to say, sync pricing changes for these SKUs, or update customer credit limits for this region, or reconcile product categories between ERP and CRM. Copilot can translate that into structured intent, scope, criteria, timing, approval needs, and which systems are involved. But Copilot should never wing it when it comes to multi-system rights, because the enterprise doesn't need a conversational update. It needs transactional integrity. So the right pattern is Copilot decides what should happen. Logic Apps ensures it happens, deterministically. This is where Logic Apps earns its keep as the execution plane. The workflow encodes ordering, read source of truth, compute deltas, apply updates in a controlled sequence, and verify results. It encodes idempotency. If the same request is replayed, you don't double apply the change. It encodes retries that don't turn into accidental duplication. And it encodes compensating actions for the cases where a partial success is worse than a full failure. This is the kind of boring nobody claps for in a demo. It is also the only kind of boring finance trusts. Now layer in the connectivity reality. A lot of these systems are not meant to be exposed to the public internet. They live behind networks with reasons, not vibes. This is where Logic App Standard and the networking options matter. If you need private endpoints and VNet integration so the orchestration layer can talk to internal systems without punching holes through your perimeter, this is where you do it. Executives hear private endpoint and think it's a networking detail. It's not. It's a trust boundary. It's the difference between we integrated SAP and we exposed SAP integration to whatever could hit an endpoint. Now bring MCP into the picture. In this scenario, MCP is not about making SAP magical. It's about packaging the governed workflow as a tool the model can call without improvisation. So instead of giving the model a connector and hoping it can construct a correct write into SAP, you give it a tool like sync pricing changes, backed by a Logic App workflow that does the ugly parts: validation, mapping, sequencing, retries, and evidence. The schema forces specificity. Which products, which effective date, which price list, which region, what approval ID if required, what correlation ID should be returned for audit. And the output is structured, not chatty. What changed, what didn't, what failed, and where the evidence lives. This is the part most people miss. The output format is governance too. If you return huge payloads and raw ERP responses, you're not being transparent. You're flooding the reasoning plane with noise. So you return the minimum needed for decisions and you store the rest as run history. Now, business outcomes. The direct benefit is fewer integration outages and fewer systems disagree incidents. But the bigger benefit is that change becomes safer. When the enterprise can trust that cross-system updates are ordered, idempotent, and traceable, you can move faster without creating reconciliation debt. And yes, reconciliation debt is a real thing. You pay it later, with interest, during quarter close. This scenario also clarifies a strategic truth. AI doesn't remove the need for integration engineering. It exposes whether you ever had it. If your estate relies on tribal knowledge and side-channel coordination, AI will amplify the inconsistency. If your estate has a deterministic execution layer with governed tools, AI will amplify throughput without amplifying risk. That's the difference between agentic transformation and agentic chaos. Next, there's one scenario that turns all of this into executive language instantly: compliance evidence collection, where the output isn't automation, it's proof. Scenario 5. Compliance evidence collection. Audits sell reality. Compliance is where strategy stops being inspirational and starts being accountable. Most executives don't fear automation. They fear the email from audit that says, prove it. Prove who approved the access. Prove why the change was made. Prove the control operated consistently. Prove the data didn't leak. Prove the exception was justified. Prove it across 3 systems that don't agree and 2 teams that remember it differently. And that's the ugly truth. In most enterprises, the work is automated, but the evidence is manual. People spend weeks collecting screenshots, digging through tickets, exporting logs, and stitching together a narrative that sounds plausible enough to pass. Not because anyone wants to lie, because the systems were never designed to tell the story end to end. This is where agentic orchestration gets to stop being innovation and start being an operating model. Copilot Studio plays the front door here, but not as the system of record. As the interface to the evidence, executives ask questions like, who has access to finance reporting and why? Which invoices were posted outside policy last quarter? What changed in the last release that impacted customer data? Which approvals were bypassed during the outage? Humans can answer those questions. Slowly, in meetings, with caveats, Copilot Studio can answer them conversationally, quickly, and in a way that executives will actually use, because it can translate vague questions into structured requests, but only if the execution plane can produce deterministic evidence. That is the constraint. So the pattern looks like this. Copilot Studio takes the audit-style question and converts it into an evidence request. Scope, time window, systems involved, the definition of exception, and what the auditor will accept as proof. Then it selects a tool that doesn't search everything. It calls an evidence assembly capability. And Logic Apps does what Logic Apps always does when it's used correctly. It executes a boring, repeatable process that creates a trace you can defend. Pull the access assignments from Entra. Pull the ticket approvals from ITSM. Pull the workflow runs that provisioned or revoked access. Pull the finance transaction logs that show postings and reversals. Package it into an evidence bundle with correlation IDs and timestamps. Store it where your compliance team expects it. Return a summary to the agent that is small, structured, and decision-ready. And here's the architectural payoff. You're not relying on Copilot's memory of the conversation to be the record. You're relying on run history. Kent described it as full traceability. Inputs, outputs, what the user said and what the agent responded. We've got a very complete picture. That matters most in audits because audits are not about what your system intended. They're about what your system did. Logic Apps run history becomes an audit artifact. Who triggered the workflow, what inputs were supplied, what tools were called, what downstream systems responded, and what the workflow returned. If your agent asks for evidence, the workflow can provide it with the same determinism every time. And once you have that, something changes culturally. Audits stop being a seasonal panic. They become a query. That's not a small shift. It's executive language. Reduced compliance labor, fewer control failures, faster response to audit requests, and less reliance on heroics. Also, it forces a healthier boundary between reasoning and execution. Copilot can talk, it can interpret, it can format the answer for a human. But the evidence comes from a deterministic system that can be replayed, inspected, and monitored. That's what governed AI actually means. Not trust in the model, but trust in the trail. And if you want the most cynical, accurate ROI statement for compliance, it's this. The business value isn't that the agent can answer auditors. The business value is that the enterprise stops paying humans to reconstruct reality after the fact. Governance that enables speed, guardrails that don't rot. Governance is usually presented as a brake pedal. That framing is why it fails. A brake pedal is something people try to avoid. They root around it, they temporarily bypass it, they build side channels. Then governance becomes theater, a slide deck about controls that were never enforced by design. In an agentic world, governance has to be an accelerator, not because leaders suddenly love compliance, because the only way to scale AI is to make the safe path the default path. Every other option is entropy with a budget line. So here's what governance looks like when it actually enables speed and doesn't rot 6 months after launch. First, role separation that matches how the system works. You need 3 roles, and you need them because the platform will drift without them. Agent designers build the intent interface, prompts, conversation flows, and tool selection logic. They should not be able to change what a provision access tool can do in production. Workflow owners build the execution plane, Logic Apps workflows, tool schemas, retries, compensations, and the integration contracts. They should not be writing the conversational layer. Operators run the estate, monitoring, incident response, and evidence production. They should not be editing workflows in the middle of an outage because someone asked nicely. That's RBAC as an operating model, not RBAC as a checkbox. And if you don't do it, you will get privilege sprawl. You will get everyone is a maker access drift. You will get production edited from a browser tab at 11 p.m. Second, managed identity as the default, not as a nice when we have time upgrade. If an automation can run only because somebody copied a client secret into a connection, you have not built a system. You've built a hostage situation. Managed identities are how you keep execution boring. No secrets, no shared credentials, no rotated keys that nobody rotates. It also gives you something executives care about when they eventually ask who had access to do that. Because the identity is explicit, scoped, and auditable. Third, tenant and environment isolation that reflects reality. Dev, test, and prod aren't best practice. They are entropy containment. Agent behavior will change, prompts will change, tools will evolve, connectors will get updated, models will get updated. If you don't isolate environments, you've created a single shared blast radius where experimentation and production share the same failure modes. So you isolate, not by duplicating intelligence, but by promoting vetted artifacts, tool contracts, workflows, policies. Build once, then promote through environments with controlled change. Fourth, network boundaries early, not as a retrofit. If you wait until after the pilot to ask, should this traffic stay private? You've already chosen public exposure, you just haven't admitted it. Logic App's standard and private endpoints exist for a reason. Enterprises have systems that cannot be internet adjacent, and when you're feeding those systems through agentic pathways, you don't get to pretend the network is someone else's problem. Private endpoints keep internal traffic internal. VNet integration keeps the orchestration layer on the right side of your perimeter. And yes, it's slower to set up at first. It's faster than rebuilding everything after security says no. Fifth, DLP as the line between reasoning and movement. Copilot Studio can reason across a lot of information. That's the point. But workflows decide what can move where. So you treat DLP policies as routing rules for data movement, not as abstract restrictions. You define which connectors can exchange which data classes. You define where sensitive data can be written. You define what can be summarized versus what can be exported. This is how you stop helpful from becoming exfiltration. Finally, authorization beyond authentication. Enterprises love saying it's protected by Entra. That's only the first gate. Authenticated doesn't mean authorized. Authorized doesn't mean least privileged. Least privileged doesn't mean safe tool design. So you enforce authorization at the execution plane, which tools can be called, by which agents, on behalf of which users, for which scopes, under which conditions. And you log it as evidence, not as best effort. This is the uncomfortable truth. Policy will erode wherever enforcement is optional. So you make enforcement structural. You publish constrained tools. You route execution through deterministic workflows. You isolate environments. You remove secrets. You keep the network private. And you keep the run history as the truth source. Because governance that works is not something people remember to do. It's what the architecture refuses to let them avoid. Operating model. Build once, reuse everywhere. Most enterprises don't lose to technology. They lose to duplication. One team builds a Salesforce connector solution. Another team builds the same thing slightly differently because they couldn't find the first one, couldn't trust it, or couldn't use it without begging for access. 6 months later, you don't have an integration strategy. You have a museum of near-identical artifacts, and now you're about to do the same thing with agents. So this section is the operating model, how you stop agentic work from becoming a new layer of sprawl. The rule is simple: build once, reuse everywhere. But that only works if you treat tools as products, not as project outputs. That means you need a catalog, not a folder, not a Teams post, not Ask Bob. A catalog with ownership, visibility, and a lifecycle. This is why API Center shows up in Kent's story as more than a wizard. It's the discoverability layer that prevents your MCP servers from becoming that thing someone built in a subscription nobody monitors. He called API Center a central hub to stop your API sprawl. That's not marketing, that's the problem statement. Because MCP servers without a catalog are just better hidden endpoints. And hidden endpoints are how governance dies. Now, practically, there are 3 catalog-shaped paths in the Microsoft estate that all converge on the same idea. First, API Center as the enterprise catalog for APIs and MCP servers. It's where you register, describe, and publish what exists. It's where admins can see what's out there and developers can discover what they're allowed to reuse. And yes, it's also where you can start small. Kent mentioned the free tier with a limit of up to 200 registered assets. That's enough runway for most organizations to prove the model without turning procurement into a blocker. Second, Foundry's tools catalog. This is the agent builder's view of the same reality. It's where teams go when they want to add capability fast, but still through a governed pathway. What matters here isn't the UI. What matters is that the tool gets created as an MCP server with consistent security and packaging, so it becomes reusable across agents, not embedded into one build. Third, native logic apps, where the actual execution lives. This is where the workflows exist, the run history exists, and the operational reality gets owned. The catalog is just the storefront. Logic apps is the factory. These aren't competing approaches. They're different entry points to the same operating model. And once you accept that, your strategy becomes less about which portal do we prefer, and more about how do we enforce reuse. Now, reuse fails for predictable reasons, and you can design around them. The first is discoverability. If people can't find the tool, they rebuild it. The second is trust. If people can't see how the tool behaves, they don't bet their process on it. The third is friction. If consuming the tool requires a weeks-long security negotiation, teams will root around it. So you solve these with an enterprise posture that is boring and explicit. Every MCP server gets an owner. Every tool gets a description that matches business verbs, not platform verbs. Every tool gets a schema that constrains inputs and constrains outputs. Every tool gets versioning and change control, because we updated the workflow is not an acceptable release node when the workflow is now the execution plane for multiple agents. And every tool gets an operational contract, how it's monitored, how failures route, how evidence is stored, how changes are deployed. Now, testing is the part everyone skips until the first outage. Kent mentioned a Logic Apps unit testing framework that is GA, and the detail that matters isn't the framework itself, it's the posture. You don't treat workflows as low-code art, you treat them as production assets. Testable, promotable, and regression safe. Because when your MCP server is backed by a workflow change is a tool change. And a tool change is now a business risk. So you build smoke tests in VS Code. You validate tool schemas. You test failure paths. You test timeouts. You test the what happens when Salesforce throttles scenario, because that's not hypothetical. It's Tuesday. If you want a single executive framing for this operating model, it's this. The ROI doesn't come from smarter AI. It comes from fewer humans coordinating between systems and fewer teams rebuilding the same governed capabilities. Catalogs make capabilities visible. Logic Apps makes execution reliable. MCP makes those capabilities portable across agent platforms. And once that's true, every new agent stops being a bespoke integration project. It becomes a consumer of a shared enterprise tool chain. Executive decision checklist, where this goes wrong and how to prevent it. Executives don't need another architecture diagram. They need a checklist that predicts failure. So here it is, the 5 ways this goes wrong and what prevents it. Mistake 1, treating MCP like just another connector. That creates tool sprawl, 50 overlapping tools with vague names, vague schemas, and nobody who can explain which one is safe. Prevention is boring. Publish a small curated tool catalog backed by owned workflows, then enforce reuse through the catalog, not tribal knowledge. Mistake 2, letting AI write directly to systems of record without an execution plane. That's not automation, that's uncontrolled mutation. Prevention is the two-plane model. Copilot reasons, Logic Apps executes. If it can't be traced, it doesn't run. Mistake 3, skipping discoverability. If people can't find a standard tool, they'll rebuild it. If they can't trust it, they'll bypass it. Prevention is a catalog with ownership, versioning, and a lifecycle. API center, Foundry catalog, whatever your front door is. The tool has to be discoverable and governable, or it doesn't exist. Mistake 4, ignoring networking and identity until after the pilot. That's how pilots die in security review. Prevention is designing with private endpoints, managed identity, and environment isolation from day one. You don't retrofit trust boundaries, you enforce them. Mistake 5, exposing generic do-everything tools. Create record is not a tool, it's an entropy generator. Prevention is designing tools as constrained business verbs with explicit inputs and constrained outputs. And that's how you stop guessing from becoming writing. Now the decision framework. Start in one domain where pain is obvious and measurement is easy. ITSM or HR. Build one MCP server backed by Logic Apps workflows. Publish it in a catalog. Use it from Copilot Studio. Prove traceability and approval boundaries. Then scale by reuse, not by cloning. That's how you avoid conditional chaos. The positive thesis, the future isn't smarter chat, it's governed execution. Copilot Studio turns intent into decisions, and Logic Apps turns decisions into controlled, auditable action. If you want the governance patterns that keep this from turning into tool sprawl, watch the next episode and subscribe, because this is where enterprise AI either scales or breaks.